It was just a school photo, rows of boys staring stiff at the camera. But in the corner, something appeared that should not exist, and once seen, it could never be forgotten. Thomas Whitmore had always been drawn to forgotten things. Dusty antiques, abandoned buildings, and especially old photographs that whispered stories from decades past. As the newest archivist at Millbrook Historical Society, he spent his days cataloging donations from estate sales and family attics. It was during a particularly gray October afternoon that Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood arrived with a weathered cardboard box, her arthritic hands trembling as she set it on his desk. "Found this in my late husband's study," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was always collecting old-school memorabilia. Never could understand why he kept so much junk." The box contained dozens of photographs from various schools throughout New England, dating back to the 1880s. Thomas methodically examined each one, noting the formal poses, stern teachers, and rows of children in their Sunday best. But it was the photograph labeled Millbrook Academy Class of 1892 that made him pause. The image showed 23 boys arranged in 3 neat rows on the steps of a brick building. Their faces were serious, as was customary for photographs of that era. But something felt off. Thomas squinted at the sepia-toned image, noticing what appeared to be a shadow in the left corner of the frame. He pulled out his magnifying glass and held it over the photograph. What he saw made his blood run cold. Peering from behind a partially visible door frame was the pale face of a boy, perhaps 10 or 11 years old. The child's features were gaunt, his eyes hollow and strangely luminous even in the faded photograph. Most unsettling was his expression. While the other children stared stoically at the camera, this boy seemed to be looking directly at Thomas, across more than a century of time. The face appeared older somehow, as if the child had experienced far more than his years should have allowed. Thomas spent the rest of the afternoon researching the photograph. The Millbrook Academy had closed in 1924, but the Historical Society had extensive records of the school's enrollment. He cross-referenced the names of all 23 visible students with the 1892 class roster. Every face had a name. Every name had a story, except for the boy in the corner. According to the records, only 23 children were enrolled in that class, and Thomas had accounted for every one of them. As evening approached, Thomas made copies of the photograph and began calling elderly residents of Millbrook, hoping someone might recognize the mysterious child or remember stories about the old academy. Most had never heard of any unusual incidents at the school, but Martha Henley, a 92-year-old whose grandmother had attended the academy, mentioned something that made Thomas's pulse quicken. "Grandmother used to tell stories about a boy who disappeared from the school," Martha said, her voice crackling through the phone. "Said he just vanished one day, and the teachers acted like he'd never existed at all. She always thought it was strange how nobody would talk about him." When Thomas described the face in the photograph, Martha was quiet for a long moment. "That sounds like what she described. Pale, thin, with sad eyes that seemed older than they should have been." Thomas stayed late that night, poring over newspaper archives and school documents. He found mention of a disciplinary incident at Millbrook Academy in November 1892, but the details were vague. The school's headmaster, Cornelius Ashford, had submitted a brief report to the town authorities stating that the matter has been resolved internally and requires no further investigation. No names were mentioned, and no follow-up reports were filed. As Thomas finally prepared to leave the Historical Society that night, he took one last look at the photograph under the desk lamp. In the harsh electric light, the boy's face seemed even more pronounced, his hollow eyes appearing to track Thomas's movement across the room. Thomas carefully placed the photograph in a protective sleeve and locked it in his desk drawer, but the image remained burned in his mind. What happened to you, boy? And why don't you want to be forgotten? Thomas arrived at work the next morning with dark circles under his eyes, having spent most of the night researching everything he could find about Millbrook Academy and its staff. He had discovered that Headmaster Cornelius Ashford was known for his strict disciplinary methods and had been investigated twice by town authorities for reports of excessive punishment of students. Both investigations had been dismissed due to lack of evidence and Ashford's connections with prominent families in the area. The Historical Society's basement archives contain several boxes of materials from the academy, including student ledgers, correspondence, and financial records. Thomas methodically worked through each document, looking for any mention of missing children, disciplinary actions, or unusual incidents in 1892. It was in a folder marked Correspondence Personal that he found his first real clue. A letter dated December 15, 1892, from Mrs. Catherine Mills to her sister in Boston, contained a disturbing passage. The school has been different since November. Little James Corwin has not been seen for weeks, though the teachers insist he was never enrolled. His desk remains empty, but when I ask the other children about him, they look frightened and change the subject. Something terrible has happened, but no one will speak of it. James Corwin. Thomas felt a surge of excitement mixed with dread. He had a name but no official record of the boy's existence at the school. He spent the next several hours combing through birth records, census data, and newspaper obituaries, but found no trace of a James Corwin who would have been the right age in 1892. It was as if the boy had been deliberately erased from history. Thomas decided to visit the site of the old Millbrook Academy, which had been demolished in the 1960s, to make way for a shopping center. An elderly man walking his dog approached Thomas, curious about why someone was standing in the middle of the parking lot with old photographs and blueprints. The man introduced himself as Frank Morrison, whose family had lived in Millbrook for 4 generations. When Thomas showed him the academy photograph and asked about James Corwin, Frank's expression grew troubled. "My great-grandfather used to tell stories about that place," Frank said, studying the photograph carefully. "Said there was something wrong with how they treated the children there, especially the ones from poor families or those without connections. He claimed they had ways of making troublesome students disappear. But nobody believed him because the academy brought prestige and money to the town." That evening, Thomas returned to the Historical Society and requested access to the restricted archives, documents that required special permission to view due to their sensitive nature. Among these files, he found a collection of letters and reports that had been sealed for decades. One report, dated January 1893 and written by a state inspector, contained allegations of abuse and potential murder at Millbrook Academy. The inspector, Harold Beaumont, had been sent to investigate after anonymous tips about missing children. His report detailed evidence of severe physical punishment, children locked in basement cells for days without food, and at least 3 students who had vanished without explanation. Beaumont specifically mentioned a boy named James Corwin describing him as a child of uncommon intelligence but rebellious spirit, who challenged the headmaster's authority and paid the ultimate price for his defiance. However, the investigation had been abruptly terminated after pressure from influential families whose children attended the academy. Beaumont's report was buried, and he was transferred to another district within weeks. The final page of his report contained a chilling observation. The boy Corwin was last seen being dragged toward the basement punishment rooms. His screams were heard throughout the night of November 12, 1892, but by morning there was only silence. Late that night, as Thomas organized his research materials, he noticed something that made his hands tremble. In the margin of Inspector Beaumont's report, written in faded pencil, were the words, "The boy spoke of others buried beneath the schoolhouse." He knew where the bodies lay hidden, and for that knowledge, he was silenced. Beneath this indifferent handwriting, someone had added, "Let the dead remain buried." Some truths are too dangerous to reveal. James, I hear you calling across time, and I swear I'll find out what they did to you. Armed with Inspector Beaumont's buried report and Mrs. Mills's correspondence, Thomas knew he needed to find physical evidence to support his growing suspicions about James Corwin's fate. He contacted Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a forensic anthropologist at the State University who specialized in historical crime scenes. When he explained his findings, Dr. Mitchell agreed to meet him at the site where Millbrook Academy once stood. Using ground-penetrating radar equipment, they surveyed the area that would have been beneath the academy's basement, according to the architectural plans Thomas had studied. The initial scans revealed several anomalous areas, spaces where the soil density was different, suggesting that the ground had been disturbed sometime in the past. Dr. Mitchell pointed to one area in particular, located where the building's punishment rooms would have been. "There's definitely something buried here," she said, studying the radar images. "The soil composition shows clear signs of historical excavation and refilling. Based on the depth and pattern, it appears to be human-sized graves." Thomas felt his heart racing as Dr. Mitchell continued her analysis. "I count at least 4 distinct burial sites, all approximately the size and depth you'd expect for children's remains." Getting permission to excavate required navigating complex legal procedures, but Thomas's research had attracted the attention of Detective Lisa Romano, a cold case investigator who specialized in historical crimes. She helped expedite the paperwork, and within 2 weeks, a small archaeological team had begun carefully excavating the site behind police barriers. The first remains were discovered on a Tuesday morning. Dr. Mitchell called Thomas with barely contained excitement in her voice. "We found him," she said. "Based on the burial location and the remains' characteristics, this has to be James Corwin." The skeleton was that of a boy approximately 10 years old, buried in what appeared to be a hastily dug grave. More disturbing were the clear signs of trauma, multiple fractures to the skull and ribs that suggested severe beating. As the excavation continued, 3 more sets of remains were uncovered, all children between the ages of 8 and 12. Each skeleton showed evidence of violent death, and personal effects found with the bodies helped identify 2 of the children from missing person reports that had been filed, but never properly investigated. The pattern was clear. Millbrook Academy had been systematically murdering students who posed problems for the administration. On the 3rd day of excavation, Dr. Mitchell made a discovery that sent chills down Thomas's spine. Clutched in James Corwin's skeletal fingers was a small piece of metal, a fragment of a photographer's flash powder container, the type used in the 1890s portrait photography. "It appears the boy grabbed this during his final moments, Doctor," Mitchell explained. "This suggests he was near the photography equipment when he was attacked, which would explain how he appeared in that class photograph. He may have been hiding behind the camera setup when the picture was taken, trying to document his presence before his attackers found him." Detective Romano's investigation into the Academy's records revealed a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of local government. Headmaster Cornelius Ashford had been operating the school as both an educational institution and a place where wealthy families could send problem children to be disciplined without questions asked. When that discipline resulted in death, the bodies were buried on school grounds and all records were destroyed. The investigation uncovered correspondence between Ashford and several prominent families, including explicit agreements to handle difficult children with permanent solutions in exchange for substantial payments. One letter, dated October 1892, specifically mentioned James Corwin as a troublesome orphan who required immediate correction. The boy had been sent to the academy by a distant relative who wanted him out of the way to claim an inheritance. Thomas realized that the 1892 class photograph had been taken just days before James Corwin's murder. The boy had somehow managed to position himself in the frame, perhaps knowing it might be his last chance to leave evidence of his existence. His hollow, desperate eyes in the photograph now made perfect sense. He had been looking directly into the future, hoping someone would eventually see him and uncover the truth. "James Corwin, your voice has finally been heard, and your killers' names will be remembered alongside your own." The forensic analysis of James Corwin's remains provided the final pieces of evidence needed to close the case definitively. DNA extracted from his bones was matched to descendants of the Corwin family, confirming his identity beyond any doubt. More significantly, the metal fragment found in his skeletal hand was analyzed and determined to be from a specific type of magnesium flash powder holder used exclusively by Hartwell Photography Studio, the company that had taken the 1892 class photograph. Thomas worked closely with Detective Romano to piece together James Corwin's final hours. According to testimony from Inspector Beaumont's sealed interviews, which were discovered in a separate archive, James had been caught attempting to hide behind the photographer's equipment during the class portrait session. The boy had been trying to document his presence at the school because he suspected he was going to be killed, having overheard Headmaster Ashford discussing permanent solutions for problem students. The photographer, Edmund Hartwell, had unknowingly captured James in the corner of the frame when the boy briefly emerged from his hiding place during the long exposure. Immediately after the photograph was taken, James was seized by school administrators and dragged to the basement punishment rooms. The beating that killed him began that same afternoon and continued through the night, exactly as Inspector Beaumont had documented in his suppressed report. Through cross-referencing financial records and correspondence, Detective Romano was able to identify all the parties involved in the conspiracy. Headmaster Cornelius Ashford had been the ringleader, but he was supported by a network of wealthy families, local politicians, and even members of the police force who received regular payments to ignore reports of missing children. The academy had essentially operated as a murder-for-hire business disguised as an educational institution. The investigation revealed that James Corwin had been specifically targeted because he was an orphan with no family to search for him, making him an ideal victim. However, the boy had been more intelligent and resourceful than his killers anticipated. In addition to appearing in the class photograph, he had managed to leave other evidence of his presence, including carved initials in a basement wall and a hidden diary that was discovered during the excavation. James's diary, preserved in a metal box buried near his remains, contained detailed accounts of the abuse he and other children suffered at Millbrook Academy. His final entry, dated November 12, 1892, read, "They mean to kill me tonight. I can hear them sharpening the tools in the next room. If anyone ever finds this, know that we were here. Know that we mattered. Know that our screams were real, even though they will say we never existed." The diary also revealed that James had been documenting the locations where other murdered children were buried, creating a map of the Academy's killing ground. This information led to the discovery of 3 additional grave sites on the property, bringing the total number of recovered victims to 10 children aged between 7 and 13. Each had been systematically tortured and murdered between 1889 and 1894, when the school's operations were finally curtailed due to changing political pressures. Thomas's investigation had not only solved a century-old mass murder, but had also exposed one of the most extensive cover-ups in the state's history. The families who had participated in or benefited from the conspiracy included some of the most prominent names in New England society. Several family foundations were forced to pay reparations to descendants of the victims, and multiple historical monuments were erected to honor the children who had died at Millbrook Academy. The 1892 class photograph became the centerpiece of a memorial exhibit at the Millbrook Historical Society. Thomas worked with local artists to create a display that properly identified all the children in the image, including James Corwin, whose name was added to the class roster 131 years after his murder. The exhibit included interactive elements that allowed visitors to learn about each victim's life and the circumstances of their death. The case was officially closed on a cold December morning, exactly 131 years after James Corwin's murder. Thomas stood at the memorial erected where Millbrook Academy once stood, reading the names of all 10 victims, carved into black granite. The inscription at the bottom of the memorial captured the essence of what the investigation had accomplished. These children were silenced in life, but speak eternal truth in death. Their voices will never be forgotten. In the months following the resolution of the Millbrook Academy case, Thomas found himself transformed from a quiet archivist into a nationally recognized expert on historical cold cases. Universities, law enforcement agencies, and historical societies across the country began consulting with him on similar investigations involving institutional abuse and cover-ups. The techniques he had developed for cross-referencing historical documents with forensic evidence became a model for other investigators. The impact of the Millbrook Academy revelations extended far beyond the immediate case. A congressional subcommittee launched an investigation into historical institutional abuse at schools, orphanages, and other facilities for children throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. Thomas was called to testify before the committee, where he presented evidence that similar patterns of abuse and murder had likely occurred at dozens of institutions across the nation. The publicity surrounding the case also brought forward new witnesses and evidence. Descendants of former Millbrook Academy students came forward with family stories that had been dismissed as childhood fantasies for generations. These testimonies corroborated many details from James Corwin's diary and helped investigators understand the full scope of the abuse that had occurred at the school. Thomas used his newfound expertise to establish the Historical Justice Project, a non-profit organization dedicated to investigating cold cases involving institutional abuse. The project combined traditional historical research with modern forensic techniques, creating a new field of study that attracted researchers from multiple disciplines. Within 2 years, the project had opened investigations into more than 30 historical cases of suspected institutional murder and abuse. The success of the Millbrook Academy investigation led to changes in how historical societies and archives handle potentially criminal evidence. Thomas developed training programs for archivists and historians, teaching them to recognize signs of historical crimes and properly preserve evidence for potential investigation. These programs were adopted by professional organizations across the country and became part of standard archival education curricula. 5 years after discovering James Corwin's face in that faded photograph, Thomas published a comprehensive book about the case titled Voices from the Grave, Uncovering Historical Injustice Through Archival Investigation. The book became a bestseller and was adapted into a documentary film that won several awards for its sensitive treatment of institutional abuse and its impact on communities. The most rewarding aspect of the aftermath for Thomas was the letters he received from people whose lives had been changed by James Corwin's story. Adult survivors of institutional abuse wrote to thank him for giving voice to children who had been silenced. Parents wrote about how the case had motivated them to become more vigilant advocates for their children's safety. Educators wrote about incorporating the Millbrook Academy case into their curricula to teach students about the importance of speaking out against injustice. The memorial park at the former Millbrook Academy site had become a center for education and advocacy that attracted visitors from around the world. The park's research library housed the most comprehensive collection of materials related to historical institutional abuse, and its educational programs had trained thousands of teachers, social workers, and law enforcement officers in recognizing and responding to institutional violence against children. On the 5th anniversary of discovering James Corwin's photograph, Thomas returned to the memorial park for a special ceremony honoring all victims of institutional violence against children. As he stood before James Corwin's memorial statue, a bronze figure of a young boy with determined eyes looking toward the future, he reflected on how one boy's desperate attempt to leave evidence of his existence had sparked a movement for historical accountability and child protection that continued to grow stronger each year. The ceremony concluded with the reading of names. Not just the 10 children murdered at Millbrook Academy, but hundreds of other victims whose stories had been uncovered through investigations inspired by James's case. Each name represented a life cut short by institutional violence, but also a victory for truth over cover-up, justice over convenience, and remembrance over deliberate forgetting. From one boy's desperate face in an old photograph grew a movement that gave voice to countless silenced children across more than a century of hidden crimes, ensuring that no child's death would ever again be buried in silence and forgotten by history.